This is Mark Lewis, and this is the second part in a series on the topic of the Jewish and Gentile controversy. And you remember last time we went to Acts 15:5, and we set up that discussion, the importance of it, and talked about various things, but introduced it. And in Acts 5 or 15:5, it says that certain of the sect of the Pharisees stood up, and this was at a church council, a worldwide, for that day and time, worldwide church council. All the apostles were there, all the church leadership was there, people from as far away as Antioch were there, Christians from, well, all over where the church had spread were present, leadership anyway. And they said, we must make the Gentiles that are coming to Christ, we must circumcise them, and they must keep the Torah, the law, the Mosaic law. So anyway, we introduced that topic and said that it was important last time. And now I said that I would go back and kind of give a background to the Acts 15 conference so that we could get inside the head of the people of the first century. And I especially want to zero in on the Jewish versus Gentile identity. As you know, being, I assume, somewhat biblically literate, or you probably wouldn't be watching this, God lost the human race soon after Adam and Eve. There was some kind of righteous generation that picked up, but they were very, very few in number. They ended just before the flood with Noah and his family. He was a righteous man. And then after the flood, you know what? It appears he lost the human race again. We were all together. We were in the Mesopotamian area and lived there together, and we had the same language. And at one point, Nimrod became our leader. He was our king, as it were. And it doesn't sound like, if you read between the lines, or even if you don't, it doesn't sound like we were following God. We had gone to the ways of deities, pagan gods, or they were, how should I say, demon gods, as it were. We were worshiping a plethorial, a bunch, a family of demon gods. You know, the sun, the moon, the stars we were worshiping as if they were gods. We had many practices. And this was before we were dispersed throughout the earth through the Tower of Babel event, which you should know. Hopefully you know. This is all in Genesis. So God began to, it becomes apparent that God began to formulate or act out. I mean, he probably always had it formulated, I don't know. But he began to, looking back, we can see that he had a strategy. Looking back, we can see he had a strategy. And the scriptures testify to this. He appointed a man, a friend. He was a friend. He was a righteous man named Abraham. And Abraham, this was after Babel, not too many generations after Abel, actually, where God told him, come out. And he came out of that area, and God brought him into the promised land eventually. But he said, come out, be separate. We know from tradition, Jewish tradition, that Abraham he did not believe in multiple gods. He was monotheistic. And he did not follow the practices of the cultures around him. In fact, God says to him, I have appointed you, I have called you, that you may teach your children after you my ways. And another place, and this is through tradition, he says, this is Abraham, and upon him I will build, he's a rock, and I will build on him. Isaiah refers to this when he says, look to the rock from whom you are hewn, Hewn, talking about Israel. He was few in number, but I made him many. Well, anyway, the bottom line is God called Abraham out. He chose him. And he was the ancestor of what we call the Jews. So you know that story. You know about Abraham. You know about Isaac, who was his son. You know about Jacob. You know about him going down to Israel. And you know about Moses rescuing them, God hearing them and having compassion upon them, and through many signs and wonders bringing them out. You've heard of all that. Those stories are quite familiar to you. Well, here's the thing. God began an extraordinary work that imprinted those people. Imprinted them. I mean, it was an impartation of a peculiar spiritual DNA. And I'm just going to read certain select passages. This is absolutely fantastic. It's when they came to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. It's called different things. But anyway, where he gave them the law, and they were covenanted to become his people. It says, this is in chapter 19, verses 1 through 6. In the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you're to say to the house of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words you're supposed to speak to the Israelites. And then let's fast forward. I probably shouldn't read all these. They're just all over the place in the first 5 books. But let's turn to Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. "See, I have taught you," this is Moses talking to the children of Israel. They're in the wilderness. "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may enter in the land you're entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" Chosen, distinct, special. How about chapter 4, verse 32? Let's see. Deuteronomy 4:32. "Ask now about the former days." Again, this is Moses talking to the children of Israel. "Long before your time, from the day God created man on the earth, ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God, speaking out of fire as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation? By testings, by miraculous signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Beside him there is no other. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you, and on earth he showed you his great power, and you heard his words from out of the fire. Because he loved your forefathers and chose their descendants after them, he brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength, to drive out before you nations greater and stronger than you, and to bring you into their land, to give it to you for an inheritance as it is this day. Nations. Whenever you see the word nations, say in your mind Gentile, because that's what a Gentile means, is nations. It's basically a non-Jew. And then let's see, 7, 1 through 11. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you've defeated them, then you shall destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give them your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you should do. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other people, because you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers, think Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Yes, well, I could just go on and on. I'm going to just flip over just so we got more of a sampling to Leviticus. Leviticus 20. So we hit every section of it. So there's 20. 20 verse 26. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart, or in other words, made you holy, from the nations to be my own. All right, let's go to Numbers now. Numbers. And these are just, it's all over the place in the Pentateuch. Numbers 23. I really love this one. This is Balaam. You remember the story of Balaam. He was a prophet. He was a Gentile prophet, but he had the gift. He had the gift of prophecy. And Balak, who was the king of Moab, as they were coming to the edge of Moab, they were beginning to setting up to enter the promised land. The people all around got scared. They were just terrified because it was a huge horde of people, and they defeated kings and in the way, and Moab was scared. The king of Moab was scared that they were going to come and take the land and conquer them. So he hired this prophet that was known throughout the Middle East. And so he brought, the prophet agreed to come to him. And this is what he said. He said, this is Numbers 23, verse 7. Then Balaam, the prophet, uttered this oracle. Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them. From the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob or number the fourth part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my end be like theirs. Well, Balak was really mad when he heard that prophecy. And then a little bit later, he tried it again. Tried to get him to prophesy again, and this is what he said. This is in verse 18 of the same chapter. Arise, Balak, and listen. Hear me, son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of a man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I received a command to bless. He is blessed, and I cannot change it. No misfortune is seen in Jacob, no Israel observed in Israel. The Lord their God is with them. The shout of the king is among them. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. There is no sorcery against Jacob. There is no divination against Israel. It will be said of Jacob and of Israel, see what God has done. The people rise like a lioness. They rouse themselves like a lion that does not rest till it devours his prey and drinks the blood of his victims. I love that. I love that. But I see a people who live apart, live separate, and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Well, on a playground, have you ever noticed a kid that's different? Maybe he acts different, he dresses different. He becomes the target of bullies, usually. Because we got this group mentality, we as human beings. Well, the nations have a certain group mentality, and continuously the Jewish people are pissing them off because, well, the one way you could frame it is they seem better than us. They don't associate with us. They do different things, and they think they're special. Well, guess what? According to the scriptures, they are special. They were special, they are, and they will be special. Now, we can talk more about that. But for sure, deeply embedded in the mind of the Jewish people is this message. You have been chosen, and you must be separate. Now, there's many ways. Many ways they're separate. I'll just list a few of them. We only got one God. Gentiles usually have several gods. They don't have, here's one. They're circumcised. I don't know if you know what circumcision is. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But it's considered in the ancient world by Gentiles to be obscene. To be circumcised was not a happy, wonderful thing. They thought it weird. And of course, nudity was much more common in the ancient world. Boys often did not, young boys wouldn't wear clothes in more tropical, because the climate was more, in the inhabited world was more, you could do that. And people were poor. And so in many cultures through time, young boys run naked. And you can tell who's circumcised and who's not. In other words, you probably, it's a real problem, dividing wise. It separates you. It separates you. Believe me, it separates you. The Sabbath? Have you ever heard of such a thing? You can't trade with people on the Sabbath. If you were living among Gentiles, say, oh, I'm sorry, can't do anything with you. It's Saturday. Food. They had different food. God gave them different food to eat. He says, don't eat this, it'll make you unclean. Eat only this. Food. If we eat different food and we say, I can't eat with you because I do, that's separation. Clothes even. Jewish clothes. They got these fringes, they got these little hats, they got these phylacteries, and on it goes. Clothing's even different. You could tell a Jew is marked by the way they dress, usually. What else? Certainly they couldn't intermarry. Well, that'll mark you as separate. So there you can't associate with, for so many reasons, a Gentile, really. You can't, practically. Hygiene. Their hygiene was different. They had all kinds of washings. This wasn't just tradition, but even stipulated by the law itself. They couldn't touch an animal that had died, for example. Their treatment of blood, for example, was different. They had to pour it out and cover it up. I take that back. That wasn't completely true. There was other tribes, nations that did that also. That was an ancient world thing more. But anyway, so there was their treatment of the poor, for example, was certainly different. Um, they did things for the poor that the nations did not do, for widows, and for the poor, for the orphan, that the other nations did not do for the most part. So on so many levels, God set them up and told them they were chosen and told them they needed to be separate. Let me give you one more passage, and then we'll go on, and I'll, in our next session, we'll talk about God's strategy on how to reach the Gentiles, what's prophesied about the Gentiles. But for now, I just wanted to focus on Jewishness and how it was a chosen thing. In Amos, the third chapter, verse 2, God speaking through Amos says, "You only have I chosen of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you double for all your sins." So there's a tremendous blessing to be a priest to God, a kingdom of priests, and to be chosen. Other places it says, Israel, out of all the nations, is my firstborn son. What does that mean? Well, in a family, in the ancient world, you might have several sons, but the firstborn is special. The firstborn in the ancient world took on the responsibilities of leading the family after the father passed. And the firstborn also, though, had the privilege of a double inheritance. So special, very special, called, chosen, but the flip side was you had to be separate. And you couldn't assimilate. You couldn't associate. You couldn't befriend or, what did they say, fraternicize, or that's the wrong word, but you couldn't hang out and be the best buddies with your Gentile brethren. So with the extra privilege, the extra honor, also came, as this passage shows in Amos, extra responsibility. Next time we'll talk about what the scriptures say in the Old Testament about the Gentiles and God's long-term strategy. Till next time, thanks.